email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clint Padgett.
Welcome back to part two of my conversation with Howard Miller, CIO at UCLA's Anderson School of Management. We pick up with a conversation about the importance of business relationships and the power of engaging with your customer. In one of the recent interviews I also read, you said the key to success is the way in which you manage business relationships. So you really have kind of pivoted from thinking about IT as a service organization to be more strategic, essentially. Can you give us an example of how this mindset has really positively impacted your growth and what you do?
Oh, absolutely. You know, it's funny. When I first got to higher ed, I'm like, here I am, big corporate guy. I know how to move an organization. I've consulted, right? And I got to higher ed and it kicked my butt, right? I had a boss who really didn't understand that particularly well, or if he understood it well, he just didn't really care to execute on it. And so maybe a little naively from my perspective, I didn't put a lot of energy into it and it burned me. And I learned a very valuable lesson, and I think even more so in higher ed. Business relationships matter. So when I got to UCLA, I spent the first 3 months doing nothing other than just talking to people, right? And I would tell you, I met with one assistant dean, and during that meeting, she said to me, you know, you're the first CIO that's ever come and sat in my office and had a discussion with me, right? I can recall 3 months later, we were talking about, I got handed a big Salesforce mess when I walked into the school. And like I said, about 6 months in, I sat 12 senior leaders of the school around a table and said, okay, school, we have this big Salesforce mess. What do you want to do about it? And the dean was sitting at the head of the table. And he said, Howard, it's your meeting, right? And it was my meeting. And none of them have ever sat in the same room at the same time and had a discussion about how to use Salesforce, right? So you find pretty quickly that when you actually engage and you talk to people and you listening to business requirements and doing business requirements has also been an evolving part of what we do. And I don't know that we talk about that as something we do so much upfront anymore because we do things in a more agile way. But just establishing the fact that you need to get people to talk to each other, right? And you need to understand how people work and how they operate. And, you know, that has been key to my success at UCLA because I invested the time in people. I'll tell you two things off of that, right? We talked about, you know, the evolving role of the CIO, where you used to have to be the smartest technical person in the room. And then you were just the person who was responsible for all of the technology. And when I describe the role today, you know, I talk about using technology to deliver business outcomes, right? And that's really how the role has evolved. And with that said, the role that the CIO plays today is almost as much salesperson as it is technical leader, right? So when I got to UCLA, I put my vision, and it was my vision at that time, up on a board. And I had to sell that vision to my senior leaders. I had to sell it to my entire team. And I had to sell it to the school. And I didn't put that vision up on the board, even though I had a general idea of what I wanted it to look and feel like, until about 3 months of conversation with the business leaders around the school to say, these are the recurring themes. This looks like the place or the places where we should be focusing our efforts. And that all served tremendously well. And now, because all of that's in place, it's easier to sell, right? And we've come to a Rev 2.0 of that vision, but it's no longer my vision, right? It's an IT vision. It's an IT leader's vision. Everybody got to contribute to it. So it's no longer just Howard's vision, right? It's the IT leadership vision. And I continue to sell, right? And I continue to sell the things about which I'm passionate. I talked about a chatbot before. We made a major investment in one because I thought it was the right thing to do for the organization, right? I have a lot of churn at my help desk, right? Nobody wants to sit and reset people's passwords all day, right? They just don't. Where's the value added for the individual or the organization to have the person do that if the machine can do it for you? It's where I started earlier, right? So I continue to look for ways to use the technology to better the organization, to keep people from burning out, and to keep doing things strategically that are best for the employees and for the organization. So
I have to tell you that one of the things that intrigued me about talking to you today was reading some of the previous interviews. When I think about IT, I think about, you're technically focused. I'm a trained electrical engineer, which is technically focused. And yet both of us, I very much relate to what you talk about. It's conversations. I'm a big fan of conversations. I mean, asynchronous has a place for sure, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think you would have gotten where you did if you didn't have those 12 people in the room talking about what Salesforce, how it's going to be used. If you try to do that through email or one-off meetings, it would have taken forever and probably failed. So I love the fact you talked about conversations and the fact that you focused on people. I think that's so important. And that's one of the reasons I really want to talk to you today, because you don't see that all the time in technically oriented organizations where we might be more comfortable. And I'll stereotype myself as an engineer. I may be more comfortable in my silo around fellow engineers rather than going out talking to the business side and trying to understand what it is that they need for us to deliver to them.
And Clint, I'll tell you, it shocked me that it was as simple as that. And nobody had ever done it before.
Right.
And I just sat back and was like, well, why wouldn't anybody do this? It just seems so natural and simple. But as you said, we've come a long way with the technology. In some ways, it's actually easier. If I take the sort of negative side to everything I've talked about with the machine, right? We would just rather text somebody or go to that forum online than to actually have to talk to somebody. It's hard to talk to people now because the technology has made it easier to not have to talk to people than to talk to people, right?
Right.
But it's a little bit of a lost art, and it still goes a long way.
And I think that's a challenge I know for the world that I live in, which is project management world. It's a challenge because you oftentimes will promote the technical person, the really good technical lead with great technical skills to be the project manager. And it's a crapshoot because a lot of times you find out that they don't enjoy that interaction piece and they'd rather go back to coding or designing things and doing the work as opposed to having this conversation with people, particularly if it's somebody who's an engineer having to deal with marketing or business where they don't speak the same language, they don't have the same thought processes, and that could be a challenge. It's tough to get through, but you have to because you have to pull people out of silos to have a conversation with each other to understand where are we going to go with Salesforce or where's this project going to take us? What's going to be 3.0? What does that look like?
Agreed. And we actually have our technical folks run projects. We don't promote them into roles they don't want to be in, but we actually think that giving them a taste of that organizationally is good for their development because it teaches them how to work with people, right? And it teaches them how to communicate. And it gives them a little bit of structure, right? And we found that to be valuable. And they've actually done a good job of taking to it. That's probably been the biggest surprise, that they've actually taken to it. But people want to be engaged. They don't necessarily want to engage in the way in which you think they always want to be engaged, but they want to be part of something.
Right.
I think they feel that their place is to be part, more than not, right? They want to be part of something.
I've always felt that with a lot of teams, a lot of project work, there's two sides to the equation, right? You've got the process side and you've got the people side. And I typically work with really smart people, as I'm sure you do as well. And so they're going to get the process figured out. It's sometimes solving that people side is the harder of the two.
Yeah, well, look, they don't like having to do documentation. They don't like having to put out status reports. They would rather not talk to the PMO board. But again, it's good for their growth and development, right? It takes them out of their shell. It takes them out of their silo. It goes back to relationships and just working with people, right? And I think at its core, people still want to be with people. Still, people like being with people. But, the pandemic upset that apple cart a little bit, right? I use this example, and it's a little bit off the beaten path, but just humor me for a second, right? During the pandemic, we went to visit a friend, and they have a 2.5-year-old daughter, right? And that daughter was born just at the beginning, right before COVID. And what that kid had learned during COVID is that people are bad. Stay away from people. So because you didn't want to get infected, right? So when she'd walk by somebody on the street, she would just go into a shell. And I felt really bad for this 2.5-year-old. But think about it, right? That was a logical mindset. No, you could be infected. I don't want to be anywhere near you, right? And, that didn't do us any favors in the human engagement perspective, right? It maybe even set us back a little bit. So We're just starting to recover a little bit from that now. I've got employees who will never come back into an office. Either they're immunocompromised or they're just not comfortable. They've just decided that they work better whenever they want to work, right? That is a challenge for all organizations at this point. We're all struggling with what flex work looks like. What's the best answer? Where employees work from? One of my big bugaboos is that people will say they were more productive working from home. And I challenge that because I don't think you ever measured how productive you were in an office. So it's not a fair comparison, right? Because we don't measure anything anyway, right?
Right.
So you may not have had to spend as much time commuting, right? That's fair. But, like you said, if you're off camera, I don't know if you're paying attention to my meeting or playing with your dog, right? I have no idea. So what does productive mean, right? So, I think to this whole element of engagement, right? I think in some ways the pandemic set us a little bit further back.
Well, I think if you're talking about productivity, you could also make the argument that there was no off button either. I mean, people were working till 10, 11 o'clock at night because you're just always on. So,
but that was on them.
I agree.
It's not like we ever said we need you to work till 11 o'clock at night, right? I tell people this all the time. I actually was one of the people who lost weight during COVID, right? And everybody talks about how they gained weight. Well, here's the thing for me, right? There's nothing else to do. You're not going out to eat. And the only thing you could do if you were going outside was exercise. So I was exercising an hour a day and I wasn't going out to eat. It was great. Now things are opened up and I'm exercising less. I go back to an office and I'm eating out more because you can, right? It's just one of those things, right? So, it doesn't mean working till 11 o'clock. It's just, that becomes a personal preference, right?
No, I agree. I just think that some people didn't turn it off when they should have.
Listen, higher ed is good at work-life balance. It's one of the joys of being in higher ed. And I would tell you that we've become more corporate and those lines have started to blur, right? But I think we have to, as leaders, be sensitive to the fact that people are going through a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
And we also have to set boundaries on their time. We had a fascinating discussion last week about allocations. And you said you were a project management guy, right? So we look at resource allocations in our project portfolio. And we had some employees who, for us were over 100%. And that doesn't happen all the time. But we had one guy who was 30% over. And we got into this big discussion about, well, how over allocated should you be? And then there was a discussion about, well, I'm a director, so it's okay if I'm 20% over allocated. And they're like, time out, right? I don't want to tell anybody how many hours a week you have to work, right? And I've never managed that way, right? It's about team get stuff done, right?
Yeah.
And so if that's 35 hours this week and 42 hours the next week or 45 the next week, I don't split hair over hours, right? But they were talking about percentages of over allocation, and it's okay to be 20% over allocated. Y'all want to impress on yourself that you want to work 8 to 10 extra hours a week. That's on you, right? My real expectation is that if you're going to ask me to put a parameter around how many hours a week you should be working or over allocated, I'm going to put that at about 10 to 15%, right? You want to work a 9-hour day, or you have to work a 9-hour day because you're a director and you have more stuff to get done and you're in meetings all day and you have administrative. I'm going to draw a line for you there. But I'm also going to put those little guardrails in the bumpers when you go bowling so that if you put the ball near the gutter, it's going to shoot back out, right? I'm going to put some boundaries around it because if you're working a 50-hour week, I'm not sure what you're working on, and let me help you prioritize that, right? And again, a lot of organizations don't do that. We don't talk about it enough, but it still comes down to keeping your employees so that they don't burn out, right?
Yeah.
And, it's novel everywhere. It didn't happen in industry. It's just, work more, right? I have this one anecdote I'll tell you real quick, right? I was working at my biotech firm and was in the office around 9 o'clock, and one of the VPs was walking around. He's like, well, where's that person? And the manager of that area said to him, well, that person was in coding till 3 a.m. They're home sleeping now. And the VP said, no, we have a deadline. Get them in right away. I want to see them in their seat. And this was pre-pandemic. This was back, let's say, between 2010 and 2012. And I just sat there thinking, so let me understand this correctly. And again, it wasn't my deal, but you're going to bring in somebody who's had 2 hours of sleep and you're going to bring them into code because you've got a deadline and not let them sleep? What do you think that's going to do to your code?
Right.
And how likely is it that you're going to have some defect downstream because you didn't let that person sleep and you just brought them back into code, right? But it's a corporate mindset, right? It's been around forever, right?
Yep. Something you touched on as we kind of bring things together here to close out. But when you think about people, there are certain people who you said can never come back. They're immunocompromised or whatever. So certainly I get that. But even the ones who work remotely that don't have a physical reason to not come back, I still think it's important that we get together every now and then as a group, just to have those peer-to-peer connections in more of a face-to-face environment, whether that's once a month, once a quarter. But if I am fully remote, I would hope to be able to come into the office occasionally, just to have that conversation, to have that connection, because having workplace friends is important in a lot of places.
We try. We don't discourage them from coming in. I think of the 5 that I can think of, I think all but one has made some physical footprint back at some point in time into the space.
Right.
But there's one who's not. We even had an outside team building event in August, and that individual chose not to participate.
Okay.
So, and look, mandate is a big word, requires a big word. I mean, we could use a lot of other euphemisms or synonyms for that particular word there. But, at what point do you force that? And what's the utility in forcing it? Right?
Exactly.
And that one individual has actually segued off of what they were doing to run some of our most visible projects and has been doing an outstanding job. Right? So why muck with that?
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah, for sure.
They're not any more engaged or disengaged than anybody else because they haven't been in person. And I think in a perfect world, or a slightly more perfect world, or less perfect world, depending upon your side of that coin, they would prefer to be engaged in person, but for their reasons, they're choosing not to. But that's not blown up on us, right?
Going back to what you said, as long as you're getting the stuff done, it doesn't really matter.
Team gets stuff done, right?
Yep.
That's the bottom line, right? And if you manage that appropriately and people still feel like they're included in getting stuff done and delivering, that's what's most important to me at the end of the day.
For sure. Okay, so as we wrap things up, I'm going to ask you 3 questions that I ask everybody who comes on the podcast. First one, are there any leadership principles that speak to you personally and guide your day-to-day behaviors?
Wow. So for me, again, it's really the business relationships that I think have made the biggest difference in my world today. I told you at Columbia, it didn't really play out as well as I would have hoped. But it's probably been the number one thing that's contributed to my current success at UCLA, for sure.
Okay. What's the best piece of advice you ever been given?
Ooh. I'm not sure that I've got something that comes top of mind. It's interesting, right? I'm actually mentoring someone now. And I think if I look at one of the gaps in my career, I never really had that mentor to turn towards. So I don't know in general that I think anybody has given me one particular piece of advice that I could just point to and say, yeah, that's my North Star.
Okay.
I've tried to learn from every step along the way to kind of figure that out, but I don't have a good answer to that question.
Well, that actually segues a little bit before I get to the last question. In this hybrid or even those that are fully remote, you talk about the little 2.5-year-old that thinks of people as bad now. I have the same feeling about somebody whose first job out of college came during the pandemic and they've never met their team. They don't know what the culture of the company really is like, because you don't learn the culture over Zoom. You learn the culture over what happens after the Zoom call goes off and how people act and what they do. And I think that's certainly a challenge. And the mentor will be another one. It's really hard to find a mentor unless somebody at a high enough pay grade is mandating, hey, you need to be this person's mentor, et cetera. Normally that kind of stuff, it just kind of comes about organically, and it's not happening right now, is it?
So
or not as much.
Not as much. The mentor story is an interesting one. We probably don't have enough time left today to talk about it, but it actually, real quickly, it came off of a sales cold call, right? And the sales rep wanted 15 minutes of my time and read from a script, and I got all bent about it and reached out afterwards and said, just be yourself, be genuine, don't read from your script. And then after doing a little bit of digging, what I found was that the guy had been working for his company for about 3 weeks. And I became less mad at him and more mad at his company for putting him in a position where he couldn't be successful. So
right.
I'd never met him before. He doesn't even work in my field. He was trying to sell me something, but now I'm trying to teach him how to be a better sales rep and how to actually just be a better contributor to the workforce. Right.
Right.
And I had never met him in person. And again, there's more story to it. So It doesn't necessarily have to be an in-person experience that predicates it, but it's unusual.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, last question. What is the best book or article you read recently, and what was the key takeaway?
So I've been following the work of Keith Ferrazzi recently, and he talks a lot about asynchronous collaboration. So I'm reading his Future of Work. I read Never Eat Alone. I really like his philosophies. We're trying to apply a lot more asynchronous collaboration. We're trying to get to a place where we trust each other. My wife watches a lot of reality TV, and unfortunately, some of that is dating shows, but they talk on these dating shows about being open and vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
And while we all laugh at that being more of a dating term, I think if you go back to what you're talking about the human element, and if I talk about business relationships, right? I think there's an element of doing business that's predicated on trust, right? And it's hard to trust over Zoom. It's hard to trust when you're not in person. It's hard to trust if you don't take the time to actually develop trust and understand what that means. And I'm really looking to explore that further because I think that's going to make a team that's performing well perform even better.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Keith Ferrazzi, 2 little data points. He was the commencement speaker when I graduated from Duke. And I got the Never Eat Alone book and read it cover to cover. And he was also the very first guest ever on this podcast about 2 years ago when he had his, not the latest book, but the one before that.
Sure.
In between. I think he just had one come out this year even, but he had one come out last year.
Yeah, so he's got Leading Without Authority in his book.
That's the one yeah. So I interviewed him about Leading Without Authority as well. So anyway, it's 7 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, except it's Keith Ferrazzi.
Exactly. It's a good place to end. Yeah.
It is. This has been really great, Howard. Thanks for the conversation.
Well, you're welcome, Clint. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to clintonmpadgett.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett is a production of Forbes Books.